I grew up in the densest region of the biggest city in South America. It's a dangerous place, to the point where I had never met a single adult person who wasn't robbed at least a few times. You know the story that, in some places, there are a lot of words to describe snow because of how prevalent it is? Well, in Brazil there are many words to describe a robbery. One particularly common type of robbery is called arrasto, literally the great dragging. It's when a group of robbers target individuals in a much larger crowd. The sudden scare makes those near the attack run away, and when people see others running, scared and screaming, they also start running along, dragging the whole crowd in a single direction, hence the name. The robbers use the ensuing chaos to flee before the cops are called, so it is usually a very brief event, usually. Back in 2009, I used to travel by subway and walk for about 10 minutes the rest of the way to college. I studied at night, and classes finished 11 p.m., by which time I would take a bus to return to the subway station because it would be too dangerous to walk this late at night. On November 10th, around 10 p.m., I was in class when I noticed all the lights in the building I could see through the window turn off, and soon after, the lights in my building would go off as well. I didn't know it at the time, but what happened was a huge blackout that affected half of Brazil and the entirety of Paraguay for a while. Power would gradually return, but things would only be normal the next day, almost 8 hours later. Anyway, the generator kicked in, but our teacher dismissed the class because of the blackout. As I left, I discovered near total darkness outside. Streets were mostly illuminated by the cars on the road. I went to the crowded bus stop and waited. My bus arrived very late, but eventually I reached the subway, and this is when things start to go very wrong. Because of the blackout, the subway was not operational, and there was already a very large crowd waiting for it to reopen. The building itself was powered by generators, but no one was allowed past the turnstiles until things got back to normal. This was a very warm Brazilian spring night. There was no ventilation in the building, and the conglomeration caused it to feel even warmer. The result of this is that the crowd was divided in two, one group waiting inside the hot but lightened building, and another waiting outside in the cooler but dark night. By this point you might already have guessed what happens. I was in the group that chose to bake instead of stand in the dark, but the larger group was outside. Suddenly, I heard a few screams, then people started to push and squeeze inside. This made the heat almost unbearable, but soon after the commotion started, it stopped. Everything got quiet, and the crowd dispersed a little. Then it happened again. A few screams, everyone starts to push everyone else inside, sudden quietness, unbearable heat, crowd dispersing again. This kept happening, I'm not sure how many times. I was equal parts scared and confused. I had no idea what was going on, but I overheard people talking and put the pieces together. I was already familiar with the fact this region had a lot beggars by day turned muggers by night. They usually act alone or in small groups, threatening people with shivs and small knives or snatching phones from distracted victims. During the blackout, however, they took advantage of the large crowd and practiced the aforementioned arrasto. What made this unusual is the fact the crowd could not disperse. Because we were waiting for the subway, no one would venture far during a blackout, and no cops would ever arrive, so it kept happening over and over again. I'm not sure if they were simply snatching phones, using knives, or both, but whatever it was, it scared those outside repeatedly. I eventually managed to call my father and asked him to drive me home. I was almost more scared when I had to walk alone the short distance to where he had parked the car than I was of the whole ordeal. I was lucky to have someone to drive me home, because as it turns out, the subway would remain closed for a few more hours. I can't imagine having to deal with that situation for that long. I still remember seeing an old lady waiting alone on a secluded bus stop in near complete darkness during my drive home. She was probably even more scared than I was that night, hard to even imagine. I also hope those opportunistic robbers got what they deserved in the end, but knowing Brazil, I highly doubt it. This took place on the night of Thursday, August 14th, 2003, the night of the epic power blackout in the northeastern US and Canada. At the time, I was living in Toronto. I was home working when the power suddenly went off. Seeing the traffic lights out and chaos in the streets, I figured I had some time to kill and decided to go for a bike ride. At the time, I had no idea the power would be out for days. I just rode and rode, thinking I would turn for home when I saw that the power had come back on. So even as sunset crept in, there was no power, so I just kept riding and riding. I wound up quite a long way from my house, and I came to this big park in the west end of Toronto. I was familiar with the roads that ran through it, but on this particular night with all the lights out, I lost my way. I ended up taking a wrong turn that brought me down a really steep hill. At the bottom, there were a few parking spots, but the only exit was a trail that ran along a line of trees extending off into the silent distance. I turned around, intent on going back up, but seeing the massive hill awaiting me, I opted to check out the trail instead. The tree line extended along a wide clearing, and in the distance I could see a city street. I decided to head off towards the street and start making my way back home. As soon as I started following the tree line, I noticed a solitary figure lurking up ahead, on the trail a few steps away from the trees. The second I saw him, warning bells went off. I thought about all the times I'd heard that empty parks in big cities at night could be very dangerous places, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just someone out walking their dog, and what were the chances that anything was going to happen? 1 in a million? I really didn't feel like turning around and biking back up that massive hill, so I just kept going. Still, I had a bad gut feeling, so I worked up to a good rate of speed as I approached the figure, just in case. It's a good thing I did. As I neared him, I pulled wide off the trail to go around him. He started shuffling in my direction, trying to cut me off. Instinct took over. I pulled even wider and started pedaling like crazy. He sprang at me as I passed him, muttering some angry-sounding but unintelligible curse at me as he dove and tried to knock me off my bike. Fortunately, I had cut out wide enough and was going fast enough that he missed. I motored like a madman towards the street, not daring to look back. I reached the street, and it wasn't until I was back home, safe and with my heart rate back to normal, that I really realized how dangerous a situation I had just escaped unscathed. If he'd managed to reach me, I would have been at the mercy of a faceless stranger who wanted to hurt me in a deserted park in the middle of a blackout. This started when my mom was 23 years old, first moved out of her parents' house into a garden floor apartment back in the early 80s. She grew up in Palatine, Illinois, and was working as a bank teller. 5 feet and maybe weighed 100 pounds soaking wet, she was this cute young girl excited to start this next chapter in her life, and admittedly a little naive. Like any job, she became familiar with her coworkers, regular customers, and other workers who worked in the area that she would see often. She told me about a cute guy that would walk by the bank that she saw almost every shift. Her and the other bank girls would always chatter about how gorgeous he was, and one day, to my mom's delight, he came into the bank and asked her to dinner. Let's call him Tom. Tom offers to pick her up. She gives her address and they agree to 7 p.m. for that upcoming Saturday. Date went fine. She described him as awkward and nervous with a lack of anything to talk about. He dropped her off a few hours later, told him thanks, but when he asked her out for a second date, she politely declined and said she saw them more as friends. She went to work on Monday, gossiped with the girls a bit on the topic. They stopped seeing Tom walk by the bank, and my mom thought that would be the end of it. Sadly, it was just the beginning. After that, they stopped seeing Tom walk by the bank. My mom forgot about him and met my dad at a local dive bar a few weeks later. 2 months go by since her date with Tom, and one night she gets home from work to find her apartment had been broken into. Front door is wide open, but all that was taken were some of her panties. Nothing else was touched aside from her underwear drawer. Weird, but she thinks this happens. It was a crummy lock, so her dad comes over the next day and puts deadbolts on the front and back door. Back door in a garden unit, remind you, the door is actually attached to the laundry room of the building, and that laundry room is directly accessible from the backyard without a key. A week goes by, and one morning she sees her upstairs neighbor, Janet, in the main hallway. Janet tells my mom that the night before, when she came home from work, she saw a man at my mom's front door messing with the handle. Janet heard the fumbling and actually had my mom's spare key, so only reason she even walked down the stairs to the garden area was because she thought my mom may have been locked out. Obviously wasn't the case. She asked the man what he was doing, and he just ran up the stairs and darted out of the building. Mom luckily slept at my dad's that night. Nothing happens for another month. My mom tells me stories of how that month she always had a gut feeling someone was watching her, but never saw anything, so chalked it up to her being paranoid given what had happened. Then one stormy Friday night, my mom went to bed early because she had the morning shift at the bank. Lights out by 10 p.m. and her fan on full blast. She falls asleep right away. She wakes up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of drilling. She thought it was odd, but it only lasted a couple of minutes, so she shrugged it off, thinking maybe a neighbor was making a late-night snack. She tries falling back asleep, but all of a sudden her fan turns off and she realizes the power is out. She gets out of bed and sees that the houses across the street all still had their porch lights on. Odd, only her building is out? She is now getting really bad vibes and is standing in her living room, where both the front and back door are. Standing in the complete dark, she hears banging coming from the shared laundry room area. Mom described being literally frozen just staring at the door when she suddenly sees the doorknob turn and a hand come in trying to undo the safety chain. She screams and bolts it out the front door and up to Janet's door, bangs on the door, and Janet lets her in. Mom is hysterical and Janet comforts her while her husband, Ray, goes to check everything out and ask a neighbor to call the police since they didn't have power to do so. Police check the perimeter, see nothing, and say they will come back in the morning once they can see what's going on in the daylight. Mom sleeps at Janet's. Next morning, they come to find that someone had drilled a hole in the back door in order to bypass the deadbolt. They had cut the phone lines and power to the building. Sawdust was literally sitting in piles in the laundry room, along with 2 peeps holes that see directly into her living room and bedroom. Someone had been watching her and thought the night of the storm was the night to make his move. Creepy. She moves back home, and they have 0 leads on the case until Tom pops back up at the bank asking if my mom was around. She was away on a road trip with my dad for 2 weeks after the incident. The only reason he was caught was because he asked the other bank girls if my mom had quit and moved after her break-in. Nothing was ever posted in the newspapers, so there was 0 way he would have known that even occurred. Police go to interrogate him and they find my mom's panties along with a necklace she didn't even realize was missing. Guy has been in and out of prison. We are just happy he didn't get to her that night, because who knows what would have happened.